For me anyway, good afternoon. I don't know when you'll be watching this. Welcome everybody, doing a great job. We're getting near the end, just a couple of more weeks and one major project away. And we're about to enter into what, for me at least, is one of the more interesting phases or stages or aspects of what we're looking at, which has to do with really 2 weeks of looking at other religious contexts. And before I get into this week's focus of that, which is the whole question of religion and culture, let me step back for a moment and review some of the, let's see if I can get it there, learning outcomes. Yes. And especially what I want to do is talk about number two, if you can see it there, explaining the potential cultural factors between the differences in the presentations of the gospel. So far, I think we're doing great on the learning outcomes as they're described in the syllabus. That's one particular one, though, that I want to encourage us all to keep thinking about. You've done a fantastic job comparing different ways that John or Paul in Galatians or Jesus in Luke Acts or the apostles in Acts present the gospel, different ways of thinking about the gospel, different ways that writers that you've been looking at in our texts have described the gospel, etc., different facets of the diamond of the gospel. You guys have done a great job comparing those. What I'd like you to keep thinking about is, are there any differences in those presentations that stem from the fact that at different periods of time, biblical authors or those being recorded speaking in Acts, that they're addressing a different cultural context or even religious context. Think, for example, of Paul, two speeches. If you want to just cut right to the chase, look at two speeches of Paul, one in Acts 13, one in Acts 14. Consider the different ways he presents the gospel. In this case, it's the very same writer, the very same speaker, actually, in this case, presenting the gospel in two very different ways, supporting it in two different ways. And think about Acts 14 maybe compared to Acts 17 as well, which is actually a little bit more even developed way of presenting the gospel than in Acts 14. But just be thinking about that. I'm not looking for an assignment on that right now, but that is one of the cultural dimensions I think that we need to look at when we think about evangelism and discipleship in cross-cultural contexts. So I wanted to make that comment. I'm actually doing this video in my garage. My second daughter is home and actually playing a video game right now, and I thought that might be a little disturbing to you and to her. And we've got a very small house, and there was really no place else to go. So I came out here to the garage, which gives me a chance to show you, let's see, back over my shoulder, bicycles, but maybe you can kind of see backpacking equipment back there. We've all got sides of our lives that have nothing to do with this course, and one of those is it's now the middle of May, and I'm already looking forward to July or August when I can get into the high Sierras and do some backpacking, which is something I try to do every summer. So anyway, I came out here to do this video, saw my backpacks, and thought, got to get to the mountains. So just thought I would share that extraneous, unrelated fact with you guys. Okay, the topic that we're starting to broach into this week has to do with the gospel in the context of other religions, and we're going to spend 2 weeks on that. This week I'm going to talk about the gospel related to religion with the question, can we actually talk about religious contexts as if it was separate from culture, or religion as if separate from culture. And then in the next video, I'll actually address some of the issues that frequently come up when we start talking about issues of contextualization, of more incarnational movements to Jesus, of movements to Jesus that start to, where disciples end up remaining within some of the religious forms of their culture. I've been very involved in some of those conversations and in writing about some of those things. And that second topic, when I do my next video, really begins to touch on questions that people will raise about the whole realm of spiritual evil and where does spiritual evil intersect with culture and religion, and in cross-cultural evangelism and discipleship. We've got to really think about that carefully. And so this is kind of a new area in missiology in some ways in terms of its reflection um, uh, over the last, say, 30 to 40 years in particular. So we'll address that in the next video. In this one, what I want to do is a couple things. As I said, I want to talk about the whole relationship of religion and culture, and whether those are separable, and even understandings of religion. Okay, and then just a brief reminder about the books. So let me actually start with the books, and then get to the main topic of the lecture. So I hate that word lecture, by the way, just so you know. Okay, so we've got three. I'm just taking them in random order. They come from the three major religious blocks. One, for those of you interested in working in Islamic context, you will probably want to think about the book by Akkad, Building Bridges. His grandson, Martin Akkad, by the way, is associated with Fuller, was on my PhD committee, and when I was doing my doctoral work at Fuller. And this was kind of a groundbreaking work. So there's a lot more that's been written since, but this was a fairly brief, pretty accessible description of evangelism, discipleship in a different religious context, particularly in the world of Islam. So you might want to consider that one. He was one of the groundbreaking people in terms of being the shoulders upon which a lot of us have stood, even those who've gone beyond or thought more or whatever. A book from the really focused on more of the Buddhist context, obviously from the title, From Buddha to Jesus. I don't know this particular author. It claims to be an insider's view of Buddhism and Christianity. That'll be interesting to evaluate as we go. But it was probably the most succinct book I could find relative to this context that would give you some background into Buddhism itself, but also from a sort of discipleship and evangelism perspective. So for those of you interested in that, there's that one. And then this one's actually a book written by a friend of mine who's actually now on staff with me at William Carey International University, where I'm the president. Paul Pennington is actually our vice president of academic affairs, and grew up in the mission field, was a missionary kid in Zimbabwe, went back to Zimbabwe as a worker. But later, after being involved in academia for quite a while, ended up involved in India. It's an amazing set of circumstances that got him there. But and began with Indian believers to work on this book, Christian Barriers to Jesus, Conversations and Questions from the Indian context, primarily Hindu Indian context. So really an interesting look. And even those of you who may choose the Buddhist or Islamic context focused books, you may want to skim this just to look at how he describes some of the barriers, because all of us who've worked in other contexts, I've talked to people who work in Buddhist context, others who work in Muslim context, which is mine, as well, and then others who work in Hindu context have really noted that many of the barriers Paul identifies, that's Paul Pennington, not the apostle, many of the barriers that he identifies are really common to the religious context, and I think it'll be really helpful if you just sort of skim that. So anyway, you can select any of those. You may want to do a mix and match. What I mean by that is maybe even working in a Muslim context, you really feel drawn to that. You may want to pick one of the other books just to kind of stir things up a little bit and sort of cross-penetrate in terms of your learning. So, all right, those are those books. Now, related to the whole question of culture and religion, are they separable? This won't, I don't have a long set of comments really to make. It won't take me long to make the comments that I've got here. The first, let me just talk about the concept of religion anyway. And I've been doing some work in this area over the last years. It's very clear that the modern, predominantly Western, post-Enlightenment, if we would, or Enlightenment understanding of religion is a pretty recent construct. And I use that word construct advisedly. Um, the idea of religion and religions as entities, um, it might astonish us to think, given the age of the religions that we're aware of, that the concept of how we define and create boundaries around them and label and describe them is fairly recent, and it is pretty much an outside description. Um, and frankly, originated in Christian mission trying to describe religion on the one hand, and colonial England doing census work in the subcontinent and beginning to label who belonged to what. And really, much of our current understanding of the sociocultural and religious distinctives of the subcontinent, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, really flow from the colonial effort to try to quantify and distinguish and understand their people. And in particular, this had, in all the religious contexts, Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim, um, this had really this had major effects that are with us till today. And it's really only recently, I think, that particularly in the mission world, cross-cultural workers have begun to realize that it's extreme. The way that we have tried to categorize the religious contexts of the world is extremely simplistic, and is especially driven by a particular theory of religion that I would call essentialism, which is the presumption that within, say, Hinduism, and by the way, many are questioning whether there's any such thing as Hinduism. Most Hindus will tell you there's no such thing as Hinduism. There's many Hinduisms. There's many Hindic influenced religious expressions, and people can flow in and out of those, and they don't really see any problem with that. Similar with Buddhisms, and also actually with Islam. To be honest, there's so many different expressions of that are completely missed if we simply think of Sunni and Shia. So. So having said that, essentialism is the idea that you can look at a religion, that there is something that you can define as a religion, and then B, that within that there is the essential thing that is the real religion, okay? What is essentially Buddhist? The idea that goes with that, sometimes subconsciously, is that these other expressions that don't fit that aren't real. They're not really Buddhism. They're not really Hinduism. They're not really Islam. And so the whole concept of so-called folk religion emerged, as if that was somehow not really the real religion. And so in the context in which I've worked the most in Pakistan, the Muslims who go to shrines and visit holy men and get charms and ask for intercession through dead saints and all that kind of thing are viewed by many Westerners as sort of folk religious people, but not really Muslims, as if there was some orthodox thing. We apply that oftentimes to Christianity, and I think actually a lot of this stems from our own understanding of Christianity. So first of all, I just want to say that even if we want to debate the whole thing of essentialist versus whatever types of religion, I just want to say that if you are working with an aim of discipleship and evangelism in a cross-cultural setting, in which will almost automatically also be a cross-religious setting, the real religion that you need to deal with is the one that the people practice and believe in that you are trying to reach. That is the Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism that you should be concerning yourself with, and not whether there's some pure thing. And so, therefore, the study of religion in order to share the gospel cross culturally really needs to be um, in a much more relational and uh, qualitative and empirical way instead of a theoretical way. So, having said that, then the big question can, and let me share why I'm putting this on our map. I am frequently told when I'm talking about reaching Muslims, etc., and incarnational models and contextualization and things like that. Frequently, people will make the assumption that it's okay for a new believer to remain in their culture, but not in their religion. And I realize this begs lots of questions that we'll primarily address next week. But the point I want to make here is that I don't know a situation, I don't know of any religious context where a person's culture and their religion can be surgically separated like that. Um, and it's as if the two things are so grown together for so long and so deeply embedded in the soul that it really is impossible to ask the question, what's culture and what is religion? Now, in a very secular Western context, we may be able to almost approach that. But that is not the context of most of the people that you will encounter if you are in a cross-cultural, cross-religious context. So I think it's really, really critical not to ask the question, okay, as I try to reach these people with the gospel and make disciples, what aspects what aspects that people live in, what aspects of their life are religious aspects, what aspects of their life are cultural aspects? I wouldn't even begin to ask that question. Because really the essential thing is we're trying to ask, as a person becomes a disciple, what constitutes faithful discipleship in that context? And let me suggest to you, borrowing and modifying a little bit from my friend John Travis, who is also associated with Fuller. I'm going to use not his real name. You may know him through other contexts, but John Travis, who describes the fact that all of us in discipleship really need to address. We really need to address four things, and I'm modifying the words a little bit, but I draw these from him. So in any context, and again, think of religion and culture embedded, the key things that a disciple is going to have to face as they grow in discipleship are, what are the things in my cultural religious context that are completely neutral, actually, and there's no problem retaining them, okay? I just keep doing what I've been doing, no problem. It's just now I do it as a Jesus follower, okay? Second, what are the things in my socio-religious context that I have to reject? There's no compromise here. I got to reject it. So, early on in India, the whole issue of burning widows after their husbands died, all that kind of stuff. Child temple prostitution, all those temple prostitution of any sort, just in case you didn't, get that right away, etc. So there's things that are obviously going to have to be rejected, okay, in every culture and context. But then there's going to be things that, if reinterpreted, this is probably fine, but I've got to really figure out a new, I've got to give this new meaning. So, for example, if in an Islamic context, I feel like it's important to continue to fast during the month of Ramadan. All my Muslim neighbors are fasting. I decide to fast. It becomes now reinterpreted not to gain merit, not just to obey the pillars of Islam, but perhaps I'm giving it meaning like I'm interceding. I'm in a participatory intercession for my Muslim neighbors so that they might actually experience the life of Christ as well. So reinterpreting. And then finally, there's some things that are going to be revalued. One of the things I noticed as we saw the movement grow in Pakistan is there was already, because of the Islamic and the cultural value of hospitality and the Islamic value of caring for the poor kind of meshed, and really the whole concern of caring for people was really very deep. But that gained new value as people became believers. That became more important in their life, and maybe for different reasons. So there's a little reinterpretation there, but it was primarily revaluing something. On the other hand, some things might get much less important. Okay, I think for a Western Christian, hopefully, as they come to know Jesus, certain things are still. I still go to work, right? As a Western Christian, I still show up at my job. That's still important, but maybe it becomes much less important for a man or woman, climbing the career ladder, etc. I revalue that. So. Culture and religion, to summarize, I don't think can be separated. And essentially, the questions we should be asking are not, hey, what's culture, what's religion, as if nothing in the religion can be followed. But really, the questions in all aspects of life become, as a follower of Jesus, in my normal pattern of life and the life I've grown up with and the life of my family, what can be retained? What should I retain, in fact? What does need to be rejected? What can and should be reinterpreted, and what can and should be revalued? And those really become the essential elements of discipleship. And let me just end with a final thing. As we try to help people understand what it means to be faithful in their religious and cultural context, I want us to understand that not just as some kind of faithfulness to Jesus, but I want us to think about one of the Ten Commandments, and Jesus repeats this as well, about honoring our parents. Jesus kind of reframes it, but and challenges it as well. But what does it mean to honor our mother and father? And if we go all the way back to the Hebrew context, that isn't just my relationship with mom and dad, and I want to honor them as people. There's a real sense in which my heritage, my cultural, family, national, religious heritage is wrapped up in my parents' heritage, and thus my honoring of them is also part of what has to be in my mind as I think of how I navigate being a disciple of Jesus in that context. How do I stay faithful to Jesus, honor my parents and the whole heritage that's behind them? We don't want to be seen as disciple makers, as people who are asking people unnecessarily to dishonor their cultural heritage and thus their parents in many ways, particularly in corporate cultures. So this whole retain, reject, reinterpret, revalue piece is extremely, extremely important as we seek to make disciples across cultural and religious barriers. So enjoy your week, enjoy the work, and talk to you again soon. Bye.